Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Cozy Crime Time. I truly appreciate you all being here with me and just supporting me in this journey. So let's dive right in. Before we get too far into tonight's case, I do want to give out a disclaimer as we will be talking about rape, mutilation, and a bunch of other nasty things. So I just want to apologize in advance and just let you know, disclaimer put out there that there will be mentions of those things. Well, let's go. The 1920s was a different time. The process of child rearing was different, and the thought of mental health issues was near non existent. And for those that they did identify, it led to lobotomies, permanent home care, and just not being a part of society. That does not mean, however, there were no other mental health issues. And today's case is a perfect example of the failing system to provide the care for someone with a mental health issue. Harvey Glatman was also known as the Glamour Girl Slayer and Lonely Hearts Killer. He was born December 10th, 1927 to Albert Henry Glatman and Ophelia Glatman. He was born and spent most of his early youth in Bronx, New York. Albert and Ophelia had met 2 years prior to his birth when they worked together at the Instructo Military Supply. They were quickly married and had their only child, Henry. A year after they were married, Albert used all of the family's savings to open a stationery store in the Bronx. Harvey was described as an apparently healthy, normal child from his mother, Ophelia, and the family, especially Ophelia, started to witness Harvey engaging in some strange behaviors. She once walked in on him at 3 or 4 years old, tying a string around his penis and then placing the loose end in a drawer. He would lean back against the string and use it to masturbate. This was believed to be done for sexual thrill and gratification, and Ophelia thought that maybe it was just a phase that Harvey would go through and grow out of. She felt maybe he was just exploring his genitalia, and that's what boys do. Other than his strange sexual thrills, his home life was completely normal. There was no sign of abuse, though his father was said to be strict, and he did find issues with Harvey's chronic masturbation that started at a young age. He was even said to go as far as to tell Harvey that if he continued to masturbate, it would cause him to get acne. It's almost like boys, when I was young, being told that they would go blind, or if you play with it too much, it would fall off. But by the time he was 4, Harvey would escalate. He started to perform autoerotic asphyxiation on himself, and there was no sign or knowledge of abuse in the home that would bring these needs or desires to light. The family moved to Denver, Colorado in 1938, and they heard there were economic opportunities after having to close their stationery store. His father felt that his behavior, which was escalating, was strange, but it's okay. After an incident where his family came home and found him with swelling and rope burns around his neck, they took him to his primary care provider. He was prescribed medication and told that they just needed to keep him busy and he would grow out of it. He did not grow out of it. Harvey started middle school and his grades excelled. He did not have any good social skills, and children would pick on him for wearing glasses, having acne, and having excessively large ears. He was said to be easily offended, and he felt inadequate around women. This fear of women would escalate as time went on into him completely crossing the street when he would see a woman coming his way. He was in a small band, he had a job, he worked as a lab assistant, and he was even in the Boy Scouts, so he was excelling at those things. Harvey began his criminal career in Denver when at the age of 12 he began to do what he called creep. He would creep on women and just kind of watch them. He would break into people's homes, stealing small items, even to include a gun. He then began to break into single women's homes. He would hold them at gunpoint, tie them up, and gag them. He would even go as far as to unbutton their blouses and skirts and sexually assault the women at gunpoint. But this didn't happen in all of his break-ins and robberies. It only happened in some. In 1944, he was now forcing women on the streets into alleyways by gunpoint and assaulting them. And then he would rob them. He had also become a hobbyist photographer. And in 1945, he was caught trying to break into a woman's home. He was arrested, and rope and a gun was found on him. He admitted to the robbery, but not to the assault. And he was charged with first-degree robbery. His bail of $2,000 was paid by his parents, Ophelia and Albert, and he was released. June of 1945, he was arrested again for kidnapping and assaulting a woman in Colorado named Noreen. She was able to identify him by a mugshot, and he was arrested and charged with molesting women. He was released while he awaited trial because his parents paid his bail again. He was taken to Dr. Wilton after his arrest. He diagnosed Harvey with schizophrenia and advised that he plead not guilty by reason of insanity. He was convicted to 1 to 5 years in prison in Colorado after pleading guilty to robbery and completely dismissing the idea of pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. He was evaluated by the prison psychiatrist, who said that he was a model inmate and a shy boy. He found no evidence of schizophrenia. There were signs of anxiety, but his emotions were well controlled. He was paroled after 8 months due to good behavior. After his release in 1946, he moved to Albany, New York. After going to New York, he resumed his creeping. In 1947, after spending time prowling and robbing people, Harvey was arrested for a series of muggings. He was arrested due to the physical description given by people that he had attacked. While he was being watched by the police, they witnessed him stalking women right there on the street. They're just like watching him do this. And on him, they found a cap gun, knife, and rope. They searched his apartment and found items stolen from all of the victims. And after his arrest, authorities in Yonkers, New York, and Colorado wanted to extradite him for violation of parole in Colorado and for attacks that had taken place in Yonkers, New York years prior. He was sentenced to 10 to 15 years in Elmira Reformatory. At this point, he did see another psychiatrist, as you do when you're put into prison, and they did an IQ test, and his IQ was 126. This made him very intelligent at the time of his admittance to prison. The psychiatrist stated that due to his intelligence, he is a danger to society. He was diagnosed as a psychopath, and he was transferred to Sing Sing prison in 1948. There's no reason really given for his transfer. He was a model prisoner everywhere he went. He was good behavior. He never attacked anybody. But then again, he's in prison with all men, so his women are his target, and therefore, obviously he's the model prisoner. He was part of the radio repair program, and when he was examined at Sing Sing, his IQ was 136. A year later, he went up for the parole board, and they evaluated him, and his IQ was 93. So somehow, between the time that he was put into prison, his IQ went up 10 points and dropped like 40 points. So, not sure how that happens, not sure what happened, but just thought it was a weird kind of tidbit of information. After serving 2.5 years at Sing Sing, he was released on good behavior in 1951. He was then sent to Yonkers, where he was immediately arrested for crimes that he had committed before his sentencing in Albany. However, because the Yonkers police knew where he was located the whole time since 1946, he was not allotted his constitutional right of a speedy trial, and therefore the charges were dropped. He was allowed to return to Denver with his parents as long as he had outpatient therapy, maintained a job, and had regular check-ins with his parole board. In 1951, he went to see Dr. Abog, who recommended he have monthly sessions and was a secondary psychopath. Harvey never returned to Dr. Abogg. The parole board, however, believed that he was going to see him as he was recommended treatments. He jumped around between jobs a lot, and he was unemployed for a lot of the time that he lived with his parents. Harvey's father ended up passing away in 1952 due to complications with diabetes, and he started a job at a butcher shop in 1954. Over the time that he was living with his parents, he held down multiple jobs. He was a mattress filler, radio repairman, and he moved from job to job a lot. Some jobs he only held for a couple months, some he held for almost a year. In 1956, he was removed from parole and he was free to live his life. The system really did great for Harvey. And in January of 1957, Harvey decided that he needed a change. He needed to start over. He needed a fresh outlook on things. And so he decided to move to Los Angeles, California. He found work as a radio repairman and just began to live his life. However, he also took back up his hobbyist photography that he was so into when he was in high school. He began to call modeling agencies and he began placing ads in newspapers that he was a photographer looking for models. It all began with him just taking nude pictures of women and using them for his sexual gratification at home. But in 1957, this came to a head. It just wasn't enough for him anymore. He ended up getting a hold of 19-year-old Judith Dahl. I heard two different versions of how he got a hold of her. One said that he contacted a modeling agency that she worked for, and another stated that he knew her roommate from taking modeling pictures and saw a picture of her at the home and then thought that she was super attractive and went back to try to get pictures of her. But either way, he got a hold of Judith. She was a divorcee and she was going through a nasty custody battle and needed funds to pay for her lawyer. She did pin up work on the side, but that was it. After arriving at her apartment, he decided he wanted to move locations of the shoot. He ended up going to a friend's studio, which turned out to actually be his apartment. He told her the photo shoot was for a detective shoot. He tied her up and posed her and began to take pictures of her. This is the beautiful Judith Dahl, and this is one of the pictures that he took of her while she was abducted by him. So he had her tied up to do this detective shoot. He posed her, began to take all these pictures, and after some time, she became uncomfortable and restless. She asked if she could be untied, and that's when Harvey, he pulled a gun on her, he sat her up, and he told her that he would keep her bound until he was done having fun with her. He later told police that she told him about the custody battle and that she stated that she was a nymphomaniac and she would not give him any trouble. Do I believe that she told him that she would not give him any trouble? Absolutely. I absolutely believe that this woman, in fear for her life, said, I will not give you any trouble. Do what you want to do. Just let me go. Do I believe that she explained that she was a nymphomaniac and so she was completely fine with all this? Absolutely not. I believe that Harvey made that up. And even if she had said that at any point, this was not a consensual relationship. This was not a consensual encounter. So even if she said, oh, I'm a nymphomaniac, it's totally fine. It's not consensual. It's still rape. It's still disgusting. And it's still not okay. So he went on to rape Judith multiple times. After raping her, he would tie her legs together again, and then he would force her to sit and talk to him in between sessions. As the day turned to night, he found his need versus want to kill her hard. He said he didn't want to kill Judith, but he needed to. She would turn him into the police. So at 10:30 p.m., he told Judith that he was going to let her go. However, he told her that he was going to drive her outside of town, drop her off, give her enough money for bus fare, and just have them go their separate ways. She assumed that this was so he had time to get away. And she said, fine. Like, if that's what you're going to do, but you're going to set me free, like, okay, that's fine. They got into his car, and Judith believed that he was just going to drop her off outside of town. As they started driving, they went south, and they just kept driving south. They drove south for over 100 miles or 2 hours to the desert. He took her out of the car. He acted as though he was going to untie her, and instead he tied a rope around her neck and around her ankles. He then stood on the rope, leaning back with all of his body weight to snap her neck and choke her. Harvey would go on to say later that I would make them kneel down. With every one, it was the same. With the gun on them, I would tie this 5-foot piece of rope around their ankles. Then I would loop it up around their neck. Then I would stand on there and keep pulling until they quit struggling. After her death, he moved and molded her body to take even more pictures of her. Dr. Keppel, who wrote a book about Harvey, would go on to say they were even more horrifying to police than the in-life ones because they revealed Harvey's true nature. They showed the ways the killer had positioned the victims and the psychological deprivation that evidenced was deeply revolting. That a human being could so revel the depths of his own weakness and feelings of insignificance through photographs was something investigators had not seen before. By the time they found Judith's body, there was nothing left tying him to the crime. This included time where the police, friends, and her ex-husband were searching for her. A missing persons went out the next day, and it had a description of Johnny Glenn. Johnny Glenn was the name that at this point Harvey was using as his photography name. He said the case went cold. They assumed that she was dead and it was left there. 5 months later, her skeleton was found by a ranch hand and she was identified as Judith about a year later. It did take time for her to be identified because her remains were so decomposed. 7 months later, however, Harvey, he got the itch again. The 24-year-old divorcee, Shirley Ann Bridgeford, had joined the Patty Sullivan Lonely Hearts Club in LA. This is the beautiful Shirley right here. And then obviously this is a picture on the left-hand side of what Harvey did to her after abducting her. The Patty Sullivan Lonely Hearts Club was a dating service in the 1950s, and they were there to help women find their soulmates. Shirley was looking for the perfect man for her and her 2 sons, and on March 7th, 1958, George Williams, also known as Harvey Glatman, asked Shirley out on a date. He accepted, though not finding him attractive, she was excited for the date. At 7:45, Harvey arrived at Shirley's home. He was greeted by a house full of guests, and he was not prepared for that. However, he did play the part of the doting boyfriend-to-be very well. After getting into the car, Harvey began to complain of a headache, and he asked if maybe instead of going dancing, they could go for a ride in the country instead. They could grab dinner along the way and just have a nice drive. Shirley agreed, and they drove from Sunset Valley and grabbed dinner in Oceanside. After dinner, he continued southbound on the road, and according to him, he had not yet decided to rape and kill Shirley. He stated he kept thinking about her children. She was a nice girl, different from Judith, as she did not strip for men for money. He, however, smelled her perfume, and having her in his car, he could not resist. He knew what he would be missing out on if he did not follow through. As he continued driving, he let his car glide into the foothills of the Vallejo Mountains. He let the car idle for a while Shirley looked at him confused. He then pulled out his .32 automatic pistol and pressed it in between her breasts, demanding that she undress. She begged for him not to do this. She pleaded for him to let her go, and he insisted that she take off her clothes. He then raped her repeatedly. humiliated her, and forced her into the desert, telling her that it was now time to take pictures. He tied her up and posed her as he had done with Judith. When he had had his fill of taking pictures, he tied her up as he had done again with Judith and garroted her. He then posed her dead body as he had done prior and took death pictures. He left her body in the desert and went home. As months went on, Harvey seemed to not even be on the police's radar, and he became more brazen. July of 1958, Harvey would take his next victim. Harvey had decided to dig up his old persona of a pinup photographer, and he called a local modeling agency. He stated that he was looking for a model for pinup pictures, and he was led to Angela Rojas. Angela was just her stage name, though. Her real name was Ruth Mercado. Ruth was only 24 years old. She was from New York originally, and she moved out to LA to hit it big in West Hollywood, as many women had in the 1950s. She wanted to be the next Marilyn Monroe, and a lot of women did. The now Frank Wilson knocked on Ruth's door, and she let him in. She knew that he was there for a pinup shoot, and she knew what she was in for. Please remember that all of these stories are unfortunately what Harvey told the police. So I'm going to tell you what he said. That does not mean that it's true. It does, however, mean that he did it. Not all of it may be 100% accurate. After he entered, she noticed that Harvey had no camera. When she asked him why, he stated that it was in the car. She questioned that, stating that it would do no good in the car if he was there to take pinup pictures. And so she offered for him to go get the camera while she changed for the photo shoot. But before even being able to finish her thought, Harvey pulled out his .32 automatic and forced her to take him to her bedroom. She begged and pleaded for him not to do this, but she motioned toward the room, and that is where they went. Once there, he demanded she strip, and she obeyed. She continued to beg for him to let her go and not to do this, and he continued to force her to strip naked in front of him. There is thought that at this point, as many of us would, maybe she thought if she just obeyed and played the part, he would let her go, and he would just do what he needed to do and leave. So once naked, Harvey pulled out his rope. He told her not to be frightened and that he only wanted to make love to her. He then pushed her across the bed and raped her. This process lasted for over an hour. He then laid in bed next to her, just laying there. He insisted that they go on a picnic. It was after midnight at this point, and a picnic seemed super odd to Ruth, and she brought that up. She said, "It's after midnight." He, however, promised to untie her if she didn't scream or run away, and they would go on their picnic as two people who had just made love. He did not see what he was doing as rape, and that's truly part of his mental illness. He saw these interactions with these women as making love. He didn't see it as him raping and violating them. He said that she faked smiles at him and he didn't want to kill her, but he had to. So Ruth got dressed. He tied her hands behind her back and placed a jacket over them. He then forced her out the front door and to his car. They left the area and they drove east past Esconda in Oceanside. And as the sun was now starting to rise, Harvey had to find a secluded spot to park to be able to hide himself. Once out of the car, he kept her hands tied and raped her again in the sand. He then shot photos of her in all kinds of positions as he had done with the other women. He later told police that he did not want to kill her, and he hadn't wanted to kill any of them, really, but especially not Ruth. He liked her the best. He felt like there was nothing else he could do, though, as he had now raped, abducted, and forced her to pose for pornographic pictures. He then asked Ruth to pose as if she were dead. This is the beautiful Ruth. I forgot to set a picture, like share a picture. And then this is her in the posed death look. After she posed for him, he then garroted her as he had done the other woman. He then stripped her and posed her as he had done before. He then rolled her into a growth of mesquite, and she was left there for the animals to get. Just left her there. Harvey was an animal. He showed no sign of stopping or regard for these poor women's lives. He had robbed 3 women of their lives. He had robbed families of their daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends. And he was not ready to stop. October 27th, 1958, Harvey had gone to a high-end modeling agency on Sunset Boulevard. It was called the Diane Studio, after its owner, Diane. Diane was known to pose herself for photographs, and Harvey was happy to photograph her. On this day, he had gone to the studio wanting to rent Diane's time. So with pinup modeling, you would rent their time. You would pay them about $30 an hour, which in the 1950s was a lot, but some you even paid $50 an hour for their time for you to take the pictures. So he went to the studio. He wanted to rent Diane's time as Frank Johnson. Diane pretended to be too busy to see him, and she offered another model the studio for him to take his pictures. So they would be in the safety of the Diane studio, and they could take the pictures. Diane said that he smelled bad, and he just wasn't someone that she wanted to work with. Frank, Harvey, agreed to this, and Diane called one of the brand new models, Lorraine Vigil, to accommodate Harvey's time that he had asked for. Eager for her first gig, she jumped on the opportunity. Harvey was all set to pick her up at 8, and after Harvey left, Diane called Lorraine and told her, "Be careful with this loser. He is not a professional, and he is rather creepy." You know what I mean? Due to Diane's warning, when he picked her up to take her to the studio, she paid close attention to everything he did. When they were headed toward the Santa Ana freeway, Lorraine questioned him, stating that it was not the way to the studio. He told her that they were going to a private studio instead. She confirmed that he was sure that that's where they were going. They were going to this private studio, and he confirmed, but red flags were going off in her head at this point. She was feeling very uncomfortable. She, however, kept quiet. She didn't want to make a mess of her first job, and they continued. He stated they would be getting off the highway at Anaheim exit, and as that exit passed, she questioned him again. He told her to forget it and continued driving. Lorraine could hear Diane in the back of her head telling her to be careful with this creep. Lorraine then told him, "I have a right to know." He told her to shut up, and she protested, telling him that he needed to tell her where they were going. Clearly, at this point, they were not going to a studio. Abruptly, however, Harvey drove across 2 lanes of traffic and took the exit for Tustin Ranch Road. Lorraine screamed, "Are you trying to kill us?" The car came to a stop on the side of the road, right off the exit, and Harvey told her to hold out her arms. He told her that she was getting on his nerves, and he was going to tie her up to shut her up. He pulled out his gun to show her that he was serious. And her fight or flight, it kicked in. Lorraine grabbed for the door handle, and before she could open the door, he pulled her into him, wrapping the rope that he had in his hands around her in an attempt to subdue her. Lorraine, she wasn't having it though. She continued to fight. He yelled at her to stay still and fought against her to keep her in the car at all costs. As they struggled, she grabbed for his gun. In doing so, the gun went off. It grazed Lorraine's leg and scared both her and Harvey. At that moment, she was free of his grasps. She took full advantage of that. She kicked the door open and pushed herself out onto the street. He grabbed the back of her sweater in an attempt to pull her back into the car, And just as she felt like she might not get away, bright light shone on her and Harvey. It was a police cruiser. She got away, pistol still in hand, and ran to the police. She dropped the pistol right outside of the police officer's car, and she was crying heavily. Harvey tried to hide beside his car. He was mumbling about how it wasn't her fault and things like that. Lorraine was sobbing. Her life had been saved. Highway Patrolman Tim Mulligan later testified that he had a lunatic stare, and he'll never forget that wild look in his eyes when he was talking about Harvey. Harvey was arrested on the spot, and once in custody, he was grilled for hours about what was going on. They even asked him, "Tell us, you son of a bitch. Tell us what you know about these girls." Sergeants Pierce Brooks and Elmer Jackson were there from the LAPD gunning for information about Ruth and Shirley. Captain Jim Bradford and Detective John Layton were from the sheriff's office, insisting that he knew what happened to Judith, and they told him to speak up several times in the interview as he attempted to lay his head on the table. Police from all over were just trying to get as much of the information as they could from him, and they told him he matched the description of the man who took Shirley. They asked him where Judith was. They told him they knew that he killed Judith. They asked about the rope and the camera in the car. They stated how the man who took Ruth was supposed to be a photographer. And after hours of these four men questioning him and laying into him, Harvey confessed. "All right, I killed him. I killed them all." He collapsed across the table crying. "You know I killed him. There's no way you could have known unless you found my toolbox." That's what Harvey said. So Sergeant Brooks asked him what he meant by his toolbox, because they had no idea what he was talking about. He said, "The one in my house with the pictures of the dead girls, that's where I hid them, the pictures, in my toolbox. You know what I mean? You're just playing with me now." Harvey, in painstaking detail, told the police everything. Dr. Keppel explained in his book, Signature Killers, that there were images of Glatman's detailed methodology of murder, which showed a sequence of terror by recreating the entire psychological arc of the crime. He first photographed each victim with a look of innocence on her face, as if she were truly enjoying a modeling session. The next series represented a sadist's view of sexually traumatized victim with the impending horror of a slow and painful death etched across her face. The final frame depicted the victim's position that Glatman himself had arranged her after he strangled her. These were the central phases of Glatman's signature of serial murder. His only motivation from the outset was the torture and murder to punish them before and after death. Even though this was thought to be an open and shut case, as Harvey had fully confessed, they needed and wanted to find these women's remains. So Harvey took them to all the places that he had raped and killed Judith, Shirley, and Ruth. Due to the crimes being committed in 2 different counties, they had to figure out who had jurisdiction. So after deliberating, and due to the fact that 2 murders took place in San Diego County and only 1 in Riverside, San Diego would be the DA to prosecute Harvey for his crimes. Once this was decided, San Diego held an interview session that was recorded with Harvey and Lieutenant Tom Isbell and Sergeant Robert Majors. Over the next 4 hours, Harvey addressed each murder at a time, as well as how he planned the murder of Lorraine Vigil, relating a story that likes of which, the 2 men had never heard in real life. Like, you couldn't make this up. He stated dates, addresses, deeds done, details to everything. He held nothing back. all the bells and whistles, everything he did, he told them. He told them how the idea of killing seated in his mind and how he grew. He confessed that he craved sex with women, and when the sex was through, he now needed to kill them. All of this was based on a sexual urge to control. When Harvey spoke, it was without drama, malevolence, or even regret. His speech was monotone, and while it gushed with gruesome details of the murders, his attitude during all of this was one of relief. Since his arrest, that he had been begging for death, and maybe he figured that this was his final testimony before the grave. The only way to get what he wanted was to kill him. He didn't want to live anymore. On November 12th, Ophelia, who was now 69 years old, traveled to Los Angeles to see her son in prison. She is quoted as saying, "He's not a vicious man. He's sick." And maybe he was at one point a sick person with mental health issues. And maybe if his family had taken care of those issues, we wouldn't be talking about him today. Some have said that this is an accurate depiction of Harvey. He was a sick man. Due to the narrative now spewing in the news, the idea of an insanity plea was out there, and therefore Harvey underwent yet another psychological exam. And on December 12th, the doctor filed his findings, and this is what he said. The individual shows no evidence of psychosis. He knows right from wrong, the nature and quality of his acts, and he can keep from doing wrong if he so desires. December 15th, 1958, Harvey went to court for his crimes. He was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. This was not truly a trial of guilt or innocence, though, as he had already pled guilty. This was a trial of sentencing. During this trial, they heard from Lorraine, and they listened to his tapes of his confession. Judge Lowe was quoted as saying, "I sat here and listened to those recordings. The manner in which these women were killed, I have never heard anything like it, and I hope to never hear anything like it again. The torment, the suffering these women must have endured during the night and in the desert, it must have been horrible." After sharing his thoughts on the taped confession, he cleared his throat and continued with the verdict. "At this point, I have found the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. I will impose the death penalty on him. I think this is the only proper judgment that should be pronounced in this particular case. Mr. Glatman, may God have mercy on your soul." On September 18th, 1959, Harvey was taken to the Green Room at San Quentin Prison. There, he was put to death by inhalation of cyanide, and at 10:12 a.m., September 18th, 1959, Harvey Glatman was deceased. Harvey took 3 lives way before their time, just because he wanted to have sex. Or was it some deep-seated mental illness or derangement? Could this have been prevented if his parents had taken the proper steps to take care of his issues at a younger age? Obviously, none of those questions will ever be answered, and there is some closure for the families in the fact that the women's remains were found. However, they should have never had to be looked for in the beginning. A selfish man who thought he could take and kill as he pleased ended these women's lives and dreams before they could even begin. That's all I have on the Harvey Glatman case. There is way more out there. There's many books about him if you want to deep dive more into it. Thank you again for being here with me today. If you liked what you saw, please hit the follow and subscribe buttons. And I will be here every Friday with Cozy Crime Time. Hope you all have a great weekend. Stay safe. Do good things. Eat your veggies. Drink your water. And have a great, great weekend. Bye.